Our 26th Global CEO Survey reveals that business leaders have never been as pessimistic as they are now about the viability and future of their organizations. The current instability of the market is also greatly impacting business leaders' confidence in growing their businesses, and our survey indicates that 42% of CEOs are very or extremely confident about their company's prospects for revenue growth over the next year. This is a significant downward swing in confidence compared to last year. In this Boardroom Forum Live series, we will be focusing on the critical workforce considerations for businesses to remain resilient and adapt within our disruptive world. These profound shifts shape how we live and work, and understanding the risks and opportunities they present is imperative. In this episode, we will unpack how organizations are starting to think differently about workforce risk in order to create opportunities and proactively manage them. I'm Rianti Padiachi, and joining me to delve deeper into this topic is Dylan Govender and Bernice Wessels, our people and organization experts. Dylan, Bernice, thank you so much for sitting down with me this morning. Dylan, as our Africa P&O leader, I think I'll just start with you. Given today's volatile business landscape, can you tell us how you think business leaders should rethink their approach in dealing with current business challenges?
No, thank you very much, Rianji. I think you're quite right. It is very volatile. I think what's important is that there's a number of mega trends that we see kind of impacting all industries, all organizations in different pace and different forms. But also, I think what's important is that we live in a world which is kind of multi-pronged with crises. Crises that some, emanate from global, but others within the Africa context as well, which makes it extremely difficult for leaders to be able to navigate these tough times as well. I think what's also important is that boards in particular have now identified workforce risk as a priority. I think it's come up very closely to how cyber crime was a priority. Workforce risk is equally an important priority for them as well. So there is a lot of focus on boards to now our CEOs to get on with the job and make sure they address the risk adequately going forward. So it is very topical. It's also something that's very relevant. And I think the important thing, Rianchi, is that organizations, to remain relevant, need to be proactive around what they do around that.
Yeah, I think that's a big topic of discussion. So I think a valuable point that you've just mentioned is they have now or are now identifying it as a top priority, but like you say, take more a proactive approach rather than being reactive. Bernice, to jump to you, can you maybe tell us how are organizations starting to understand these wide-ranging challenges? Because without the rapid pace of change, especially in the business operating environment, I can assume that there are wide-ranging challenges. So how are businesses currently dealing with these?
Maybe let me start off with saying a lot of organizations has made big strides to actually managing their workforce risk, but we're still seeing that 1 in 4 of these organizations are very reactive in terms of risks. They're waiting for this risk event to occur and then they deal with it. So to your point, there's a need for organizations to be proactive and to holistically think about risk. Where they get it right, these organizations are actually leveraging data and analytics to identify proactively the risks and opportunities that they might have from a workforce perspective, and then also develop those interventions that gives them the competitive advantage that decreases their costs and actually just help them from a strategic perspective. Now, when you think about it, we as PwC, for instance, have identified 170 different workforce risks that an organization could potentially face. Now, that's a lot of risks. And it's important for organizations to actually use these risks and develop a framework, a risk framework that is manageable and easy to understand and easy to identify their workforce risks. Now, a way to do this is looking at 4 categories of workforce risks. The first is your brand and reputation. So what are those risks that actually impact your brand and reputation? For example, if an employee leaks confidential information, that can have big consequences from a brand and reputation perspective. The second area is organization. So everything related to your processes, your operating model, your functions, and the risks actually related to that. So if you're going through a large transformation, what are all the workforce implications of that transformation? The third area is your regulatory and compliance, and this covers things like your equality, your diversity and inclusion, your ESG reporting. That's something that's quite topical at the moment. You need to consider these risks from a workforce perspective and how they impact your business. And then the last one would be your talent and people. And that really relates to attracting and retaining your people. What does your skills look like? So big risks that come up here is, do I have the right skills for the future? What is the impact of AI on my workforce? So key learning here is that organizations need to look holistically at risk and proactively at risk, as well as the power of actually looking at how interconnected these risks are.
Okay, great points there. I'm just astounded at the 170 workforce risks. That's an enormous number. I assume, or you can, clarify for me, that maybe not all would apply to all types of businesses. It would depend on a couple of things.
No, correct, yeah. So this is a global risk framework, the 170 across various industries. So within each industry, certain risks will be more relevant than others. And then also for a particular organization, something might not be relevant. So for example, maybe taking high attrition risk, that might not be relevant in something like a front office sales environment where that isn't a risk. So it's critical to understand what you are exposed to and where it will have a big impact actually on your business. And those are the risks that you actually prioritize and focus on.
Yeah. Dylan, you've been in the industry for a really long time. Through your experience and, dealing with some of your clients, can you provide us with some examples of what you are seeing in this space?
Yeah, sure, Rianji. I mean, just to say that we work, as you rightfully pointed out, we work across many industries, many clients and so forth. And we're seeing some common trends. I mean, the important thing is that you don't look at workforce risk in isolation from productivity, performance, and high-performing teams. I think that's important. And I think linked to that is you touched on the CEO survey, but I think there's another piece of work from PwC, a large survey, which was the hopes and fears. And that was testing the sentiments of employees across the globe, many countries involved. And one of the key things that came out of that is that the whole issue around workforce risk and around employee value proposition, the EVP, is something critical. And there's almost, it synchronizes, there's a direct correlation. If you start to get those basics right, you start to impact on productivity and performance in terms of how the organization. I think what's important is that it's not just about the skills, it's also other elements. And Bernice touched on the other dimensions around workforce risk. We mustn't think of workforce risk as just being skills and talent. Yes, it's absolutely critical. It is critical in terms of businesses being relevant for the future. But I think it's beyond that in terms of the EVP, which really, you want to have an engaged workforce. You want them to be highly productive in terms of performance, but also be able to retain them as well. That's key, because there is a war out there for talent. And we know that organizations are competing in particular industries with each other for the key skills. How do you make sure you bring the best to the table and you retain those skills to be highly productive? So we're seeing that in every industry. I mean, as we've just discussed now, different organizations and clients at different levels of maturity. But the framework that Bernice alluded to, it's a framework that needs to be customized for your industry, your organization, and then start to prioritize what's happening. Maybe the last point, Rianti, is that I spoke of, board involvement and this becoming a high level risk now at this point in time. But if you look at King 4 in terms of corporate governance perspective, it's almost implicit there that organizations now need to look at workforce risk as an absolute priority. Where we've seen it happen, it's happened in fragmented fashions. So that's, in my experience, what I've seen out there. It's about tackling performance or tackling productivity without having the bigger picture, the holistic way of looking at it.
Maybe if I can jump in here with a practical example that we've recently experienced where, especially where Dylan mentioned, it's not just about the skills and the talent. So we had a large organization that was pushing a lot of potential employees through learning and development, upskilling them for particular roles within the organization. Now, when they did that, it took these employees about 1 or 2 years to get through the course. And as they came out of it, there was actually no space in the business for them. So it's the flip side to actually have a skill scarcity. We have too many skills. And that comes down to that organization not actually planning for their future workforce correctly. So they went back, they started doing their workforce planning, where they have gaps in skills, where they don't have gaps or oversupply. And in that way, they were able to recruit in the right way and train in the right way. But through that process, then they also realized that we actually need to start looking at what is the employee value proposition for these new skills coming in? How do we measure their performance? What happens with the people that are moving out of the business and those that are remaining? So it just shows that level of connectedness between everything.
Absolutely. I feel like it's all so intertwined.
Yeah.
There, yeah, and you wouldn't want to be explore efforts that are counterproductive to your purpose, right? Yeah. Dylan, I'm glad you mentioned a flagship report that we actually do here throughout PwC Africa globally, but then localize it, being the Africa Workforce Hopes and Fears survey. I just want to touch on one of the key findings, right? That being that talent is hiding in plain sight in Africa. It's a little bit alarming to me. Over a third of employees have skills, or indicated in the survey that they feel they have skills that are not clear from their resumes, right? And a similar proportion feel that they have missed out on job opportunities because they lack the right connections. So I think we must pay attention to that. How can organizations take advantage of this opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just to put a little bit more context, the hopes and fears as well, is that if you look in the Africa context, I mean, Africa as a continent will have the most youthful, the highest number of youth between the ages 18 to 24 in 2030. Close to almost 48% of the population in Africa will be youth. And one needs to give due consideration to that. It poses huge challenges in one end in terms of pressure on government, pressure on education system, health system. But at the same time, there's a wonderful opportunity there. And organizations operate in an ecosystem. I mean, you need to ensure that you take this into your mix when you're putting your strategy together. I think getting back to the point on the skills thing, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the key skills that people have, they want to obviously get into organizations, but it's not just about a qualification anymore. The days of having just a formal qualifications and not being able to have other skills that are relevant to be able to, to master what you're doing and be able to flex. And you mentioned in your introduction about the adaptability around being agile. That's what is becoming a key skill about youngsters need to have in order to flex, pivot, and be able to know where the business is moving and how do they use their skills adequately as well. It's absolutely a case around not just around the skill sets, but it's also to do with the EVP, which Bernice touched on as well. You've got to, attracting the skills is one thing. And we've seen some organizations do fantastic jobs. The key thing is how do you retain them and make sure they're highly productive on a consistent fashion in terms of becoming high performing.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges for business leaders today is retaining your talent, because let's face it, people have options. It's just how things are today. So Bernice, what would you say are some key starting points that organizations should focus on when looking to advance or mature their workforce capability?
Yeah, so I think as a first step, there's a key need for your chief risk officer and your chief people officer or chief HR officer to actually work much closer together when it comes to workforce risk. So traditionally, HR would do their thing, the risk function would do another thing. But now it needs to be much closer. Your risk function needs to monitor these risks. They need to highlight where it becomes critical. And the HR function needs to get or develop methods and mitigation to actually manage and remove these risks. So there's a need for them to move a lot closer. Secondly is organizations cannot think of this as a once-off thing to measure or understand their workforce risk now and then think we're okay for the next 2 years. You actually need to do this on a consistent basis because the world is changing so fast. The workforce risk today might not be a risk tomorrow, and there might be a whole new risk that they need to be considered. So the third point I would mention is also that organizations need to think through or highlight the triggers within their organization. So trigger is an event that could lead to potential workforce risks and opportunities. So something again like a large-scale transformation within the organization. That would have key implications. And there's a multitude of these events that might happen. And then the last point I would mention is actually just using your data from a workforce perspective to provide insights and help you prioritize and proactively identify these workforce risks.
Data couldn't be more important. There's nothing worse than having it and not utilizing it for your benefit. Yeah. Dylan, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, maybe just to amplify 2 points that Bernice made, I think you touched on the data and insights is the critical starting point in terms of gathering that data. And we're not just talking about data, as I said earlier on, about skills, but what is the temperature on the ground in terms of employee value proposition, as an example? What is happening from a productivity perspective? What is happening from an absenteeism perspective? So you've got to look at it with different lens, and that's critical. I think what's important as well is that when you identify that, you need to prioritize. I think often I've seen organizations that this becomes such a mammoth task to now tackle because there's so many sets of data coming. How do I analyze all this work? How do I make sense of it? So the important thing is to start prioritizing. I think linked to that is, and Bernice touched on it, it is not an event. It's a journey you embark on because the world is changing so fast. What may be a reality now may not really be a reality in terms of a key or critical skill in a year to come. So it needs to be an ongoing process in terms of tackling this whole issue around workforce risk and having a structured way of approaching it. I've seen too many times, you ask me examples of clients where I've seen too many times they tackle it in fragmented fashion. And then they realize there's no return on investment, there's no return on experience in terms of what they're doing, is because they haven't synergized and brought it all together in a seamless fashion, but also sequentially in terms of how they put their plans together to address this.
Thank you both. It was such a riveting, detailed discussion. I love the questions that were raised and the facts that were mentioned, the examples as well, because I'm sure somebody could be watching online and thinking, well, I'm, facing some similar risks, or we made, some of those same errors. But thanks again. Your expertise is always appreciated. And thank you to you, our online audience, for tuning into another episode of PwC's Boardroom Forum Live.